Commonly, eco-districts have been used as a concept, the idea being that neighborhoods or slightly bigger than neighborhood scales could band together to try to save resources, use environmental resources, sort of an environmental concept to sort of better use water, energy, waste products, very much an environmental, eco sort of focus to a place on the map. In Cully, we're incorporating into the Living Cully Eco District some of those things in addition to more primary emphasis on the equity piece, which has been less of a focus in some of the other eco districts. So how can we really bring access to those environmental assets and employment opportunities and community opportunities to low income and people of color in this neighborhood? Yeah, so Cully's a very diverse neighborhood. We have, according to the census data, we're one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Portland. I can't remember the exact year, but in the mid 80s, the Cully neighborhood was annexed into Portland. Before that, we were unincorporated East County. So a legacy of that is we have somewhat less services in terms of parks and community amenities and community centers and no libraries. So yeah, diverse neighborhood, some low-income folks, and not a lot of access to the sort of typical kind of livability resources that you might have in a more affluent or more developed neighborhood. So diversity both in terms of income, we've got low-income folks and more upper-income folks, and then lots of ethnic diversity. So there are folks, recent immigrants from African countries, Somalia, African American, Hispanic, lots of languages are being spoken in this neighborhood on a regular basis. So there are two things. There's a Living Cully, the Living Cully consortium, I guess you'd call it, collaboration is our four nonprofits working together. So it's Habitat for Humanity, a group called Verde, who works on creating employment and economic opportunities for people of color and low-income folks. There's Hacienda, which kind of specializes in housing issues. And then NAYA, the Native American Youth Association. So working with Native American tribal members, both in the neighborhood and outside the neighborhood. Those four groups have gotten together to really work on these emphasis on social equity while at the same time developing environmental resources. The community advisory panel that I sit on is part of just sort of helping to broaden out from just those four organizations, having more community members sort of on board and helping kind of think through the bigger issues and make connections out to the bigger community. So I ended up on the board partly because I'm faculty at Portland State and partly because I live here in Columbia Eco Village and we're a neighborhood resident. Yeah, so one particular piece we're working on there are lots of moving pieces, but one particular piece is work on anti-displacement, you might say anti-gentrification. The goal is to really make Cully a much more livable, better neighborhood for everybody, more amenities, more access to parks, more walkability, more sidewalks, all that stuff, while at the same time, which will inevitably increase property values and desirability of people wanting to live here, but at the same time maintaining conditions for folks who are lower income or who might be displaced in this process of property values going up, create conditions for them to stay. So we're looking at land banking, looking at how to land trust sort of models, sort of a lot of different models about how to maintain a certain percentage of protected low income, either rental or purchased housing. Yeah, so various versions, and becomes out of my expertise really, but it's various versions of putting the land into some sort of trust, either owned by a nonprofit or some sort of community organization where that land is owned and then under contract to be low-income housing, basically trying to find ways to protect housing units from the increases that will inevitably happen as the neighborhood gets better. There's a particular group called Proud Ground where the homeowner can buy the home, the person living there owns the home, can gain equity as the value of the home goes up, but they don't actually own the land itself, so in a way that protects it a little bit from the increases in price in the market. So if they go to sell that home, they can make some money on equity, so they're building wealth for themselves, but at the same time they're not building so much wealth in that they own the whole. the increase in the price wouldn't keep up with sort of market increases. You know, I think it's because this story is played out in at least 2, 3, 4 neighborhoods already in Portland. I mean, it's a story that's played out all over Portland where a neighborhood is in somewhat disrepair, low on services. It improves quickly and then very quickly people are displaced. So it's a story that has happened often enough where the outcome can be sort of predicted. And I think this neighborhood we're at is just on the frontier. It's just on the cusp of becoming that sort of place that's going to receive more investment, receive more services, and sort of, yeah, how do we not play out that story that we've seen play out so many other times? Businesses aren't involved per se as partners, but they're on board. I mean, part of the goal definitely is to create better conditions for local businesses. And one other piece, actually businesses are involved, because one piece of the sort of anti-displacement strategy is trying to figure out how to create job opportunities for folks who live in the neighborhood. So in addition to protecting keeping home values protected for low-income housing, helping to raise the income of folks in the neighborhood is another, it's sort of the yin to the yang of the cost of rent. So yeah, there's been some work with employers in the neighborhood trying to get them to commit to a certain number of their jobs going to folks who live in the neighborhood themselves. And Verde, one of the partner organizations, is actually committed to providing training. So let's say a particular business needs somebody who's trained in use of a particular machine. Verde will step up and try to train 1 or 2 neighborhood people so they actually can do the job. So it's not just left up to the employer to have to sort of train people from the neighborhood to do the work that needs to get done. So yeah, that's part of the partnership piece. Well, yeah, I mean, the funding is already coming in. The city of Portland or the Portland Metro provided, I'm not sure the exact number, but $2.5 million, $3 million to develop a park. There's money coming in from the Department of Transportation to improve roads and sidewalks. So it's sort of working at it from lots of different directions. I think the money for the land trust, land banking, people are working on grants. Habitat for Humanity sometimes has some, they have their network of fundraising. So I think the goal is to take a kind of a multifaceted approach and work on improving the neighborhood at the same time we're working on creating ways to not displace the folks as the neighborhood improves. Yeah, and trying to also create opportunities for local businesses and the kinds of businesses that folks living in the neighborhood might want, supermarkets, that sort of thing.
Right.
That's a good question. I mean, I guess one of the goals is that the mix of people looks something like it does today. Obviously, people come and go and decide to leave for various reasons, but the goal is to try to keep a diverse mix of folks here in terms of ethnicity and income level. But at the same time, I think the goal is to see more people walking, more people on bikes. I mean, right now, yeah, there's not a lot of cycling. There are people biking around, but there are a fair number of busy streets that aren't quite very accessible. There's some great natural areas sort of just on the border of the neighborhood, but you can't really get there unless you have a car. So I think the goal is, in a perfect world, it's vibrant local businesses, diverse neighborhood, folks walking around, and then getting to parks. And another piece of this that's being worked on also is schools and sort of school capacity. We have we're a little bit pinched in terms of the schools aren't quite big enough and don't have the resources to serve the people in the neighborhood. So I think another goal of this project is for the neighborhood schools to be desirable enough so even the folks who could afford or have some means of sending their kids to school someplace else choose to keep them in the neighborhood schools because they're the kind of schools you'd want to keep your kids in. I mean, things are changing. I think next year as Cali Park is opening, I mean, already that will feel like an improvement. I mean, it already is starting to feel better in terms of amenities and sense of community than it did even last year. So I think change will happen very fast, and I think that's part of the challenge with the anti-displacement piece. As soon as change happens, folks with more resources and whatnot will notice that, and so yeah, I think my sense is change for the good will happen very quickly in this neighborhood. Yeah, some interns from Portland State have been particularly involved in the anti-displacement piece. They did a report called not in Cully, which basically refers to the displacement and gentrification that's happened in at least 3, 4, 5 other neighborhoods in Portland that are closer into downtown. So Cully is just 1 or 2 neighborhoods removed from where this has happened over the last 5 years. So the campaign they came up with was not in Cully, as in the same process we don't want to unfold in Cully. So Portland State and these students have been involved in that, sort of talking to, basically telling the stories of what happened in the other neighborhoods, and then sort of figuring out what would it take for that story to not play out in Cully. And it's the things we've been talking about: low-income housing, jobs, access to childcare, so more women and both parents can work if they need to. There is apparently a lack of affordable childcare in the neighborhood also. We're almost there. I think Living Cully very much wants to be a model to the extent that we can, but yeah. I would say a strategy. So I'm not a member of Living Cully per se. I'm on the community advisory board, but I think the biggest lesson I've learned from this, and it's not really a resource, but just seeing a diverse set of nonprofit organizations who have similar, parallel, but you could see in a less ideal world could also be competing for limited resources agenda, have really gotten together, dropped down their barriers a little bit, and decided to work, really decided by sort of a force of will and dedication to work together and not compete for possibly limited resources, and try to work more in a collaborative, thank you. Yeah, so much more in a more collaborative setting, and work towards shared common aims, and sort of set aside their particular agendas or modify their particular agendas to get on the same page. Our hope is that relatively soon we'll be able to provide more resources and more, at least tell our story in a way that might be meaningful to other places.